Hey everybody, I'm David Corsaro and it's time to be awesome. I'm down here at the Carolina Close-Up Convention right now in Charlotte, and my good friend Karl Hein agreed to come on the show. Thanks for coming on. Thank you very much. And so a lot of people out there probably know Karl from his killer shuffle, the Hein Shuffle, or Hein 500, which spawned tons of variations, but you were really one of those key ones that brought that switch sort of into the mainstream a little bit.
Yeah, Hein 500 and Hein 500, and of course Pat Page's original thing. You know?
Yes, but without a doubt, I mean the problem with the Pat Page trick was around for quite a while,
Long time.
And then yours sort of brought it into what I think was this new level, where Sanders and a bunch of other people sort of took that idea and
cleaned it up a lot. It made it a lot more, I think, magical looking rather than
absolutely just the straight move. The thing I wanted to talk to Karl about is if you ever had a chance to see Karl perform or lecture, what you see is a really beautiful balance of moves and some knuckle busting is the wrong word, but definitely things that require some work, but good presentations, worker material, stuff that can translate to laymen as well as magicians. That's what I wanted to sort of talk to you about.
Cool.
Is that something that you try to do when you create new material? Do you say, okay, I want this to be non-self-working, or I want it to be something that's going to put a little effort into it? Or is the effect the ultimate?
The creative process is different for everyone. And
what's for you?
Yeah, so for me, I'm more of a problem solver. So I usually more figuring out problems to solve and then work that into how to make it entertaining. Sometimes it's a slow process. Sometimes it's little tweaks, like Hein 500 started off as Hein 500, or Patrick Page's thing and kind of a variation of that. And over the period of maybe 2 years, I made slow changes without even really recognizing it myself. I just was constantly fixing problems to get better reactions constantly.
While performing?
Okay. Yeah. So it was for that example, it was a very slow process, and after 2 years, you look at it and you're like, oh, this is something completely different. I didn't realize until I started showing it to magicians, and they're like, wow, that's completely different. And so some of those small changes grow over time. Other things like the Hein Shuffle and some of the more technical stuff I'm known for, those are just moves, but then incorporating those into routines is what makes it really interesting and exciting, and being able to make it commercial. Any shuffle is not really commercial until you put it into something that's a routine.
True.
So that's a whole different thing as well.
But is that sort of your ultimate goal because you perform for magicians as well? You lecture. You're at conventions. My point is you're up sessioning late at night, sort of doing material.
But I create things more for myself and for my audiences than I do for magicians.
Okay.
And I think any art form, there's a balance between being the commercial whore and being the guy that just sits at home in his living room playing with his deck in front of the mirror and there's no audience. And it's always a matter of finding that balance between those two things. Because I really enjoy just working on sleight of hand problems and getting better at certain sleights or creating new sleights and working on things. But in the end, you also have to balance it out with how your audience reacts to it. And so finding that right balance for you is different for everybody. Some are on this end, some are on this end of the spectrum, and that's fine. It's just whatever that balance is right for you.
So do you find that in terms of your creative process, is it more about seeing the finish line and how do I get to that? Or is it starting with something that you already have and then moving towards that?
It's both. I mean, just different things are examples of both, I think. And sometimes, like when you start to go teach stuff, then you change things a little bit more because you try to make it a little bit simpler for the average magician to be able to learn. So there's some moves I wouldn't have created if I wasn't having the goal in mind of making it easier to do. And sometimes making it easier to do actually makes it better.
Making it easy. What do you mean? You mean making it easier technically?
Make it easier technically sometimes it creates another problem to solve. So how do I make this something that's I'm doing difficult that I can do, but most people can't do? If I'm going to teach this, how do I make it so they can learn it easier? And sometimes that gives you a different problem to solve, and then solving that problem, you create things you weren't planning on creating, but end up being even better. So simplicity, anytime you can simplify things, is always better.
But what's interesting about that, it's a real interesting point you bring up, because you're simplifying the concept or the process, but you're adding into it sometimes difficult moves or difficult sleight of hand to solve that problem.
It's sometimes sometimes the more difficult sleight is the best way to get the result you want, and sometimes it's not. And you always have to constantly evaluate that. Sometimes you want to do something just because you want to do it because you want to do the sleight of hand. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that, again, it's that balance of you putting your own artistic ability into doing something because I want to do it for myself, even though there is some level of connection with the audience. But there's other things I do just because I know the audience loves it, even though because it's, maybe it's a hack line even sometimes. You just know your audience loves it, and a lot of what you do when you perform is getting that information from your audience. You know?
That feedback. That
Yeah.
Sort of...
So it's a little bit of everything. You know, it's for me at least. It's not one or the other. You know.
How often, when you are creating new material, do you hit a roadblock that you can't solve? That you go, you know what? I don't know. Do you sort of put it in the drawer and say, I'm going to go back to this in 2 years, or do you stop and go, no, this is my new problem, and I'm going to work until I solve it?
I try to just walk. I usually try to work through till I solve it. I mean, again, a lot of things will get to a point where I can get them and perform them. And for me, I learn the most by performing sometimes for people. Because when you perform for a long time, you feel comfortable, and so you feel comfortable making mistakes in front of people and knowing you can get out of it. And there's always a lot of my style is multiple phases of things. So if I screw up something or they catch something, it's okay because I got 5 more things coming that they're going to completely forget about that as long as you don't overreact that. That's my style and how I perform. I don't build up to one thing typically that if it screws up, I got nowhere to go.
That's true.
And so by performing in that way, for me, I found that a lot of times when I'm working on something new, I get little tiny small changes in things over time, but constantly tweaking to get the better reaction, get the flow right, get the rhythm right. And I think a lot of it for me and a lot of really good performers, it's getting that right rhythm and cadence when you perform. There's always this constant flow. And you can tell when I can tell when I'm doing something new because I don't have that rhythm.
Okay.
It's more for me finding that rhythm than it is finding anything else.
When you're performing for lay people, so what percentage of your worker set would you say is tried, true, Karl can nail it in his sleep stuff, and stuff that you want to introduce or maybe consciously tweaking a little bit?
When I perform professionally for lay people, almost everything I do is 100%.
Okay.
In general, when I'm performing at maybe at like a bar or a restaurant with friends or just going out and just that's usually when I practice most of my things. There's some things like I have some regular events I do every week for the past 7 years, and some of the families come see me every single week, and I know them personally, so it's not like they're clients, but they're not. I think they're friends too, and so those people I feel like I can try new material out.
Play with a little bit.
My rhythm isn't right, and I'm not always 100% on. Doesn't matter. Whereas other gigs I'm getting paid to do, paid a lot of money to do, and it's people's first time meeting me, I want to make that strong impression.
Sure, obviously you want to bring out the stuff.
So and that stuff you've done 1,000 times, and that's why you do it. You do those few things tens of thousands of times, and you always know how to get in and out of that under any situation. Because you've experienced every worst possible scenario.
That's true.
Over the years, you know.
Well, that's something because you're a worker. You are a worker, and I think that a lot of people who are watching this show who are maybe part-time pros or somebody who just performs occasionally, we can go out and buy 100 different DVDs with 100,000 different tricks on it and things like that, but I really admire the advice of somebody who goes out there and works their butt off because there's certain things that they just know through experience that most people can't find in the description of a trick in a book.
Right.
And that's what I think a lot of your material that I've seen you do before, you see those little nuances. When you perform, you were doing some stuff down in the restaurant earlier today. As you're performing it, you see that you sort of break from the I'm going to try to impress my magician's mode to there's just certain parts of your body language, certain parts of your style, that come out from I've done this
many times.
right. But it's this naturalness that's been built.
Yeah.
It's this, and that's
and not natural to me because when I was a kid, I was very I wouldn't say shy, but I was very reserved, and I wasn't that guy that was all here and doing all this typical beginner magician, and just from performing that came out of that shell, But a big part of it, I really feel, is being realistic with yourself and how your audience perceives you. A lot of people are unrealistic in how their audience perceives them, and realizing I can sense, and I think most really good performers can, and when you're performing a trick, you can sense when someone's busting your palm, when someone sees it, when someone knows what you're doing, because you're being honest with yourself, and you can see it in their eyes, even though they're not saying anything, you see it in their body language, if they've caught you, or if they think they might know something's going on, or they're not being that impressed, or they really don't want you to do magic for them when you walk up to the table. It's reading a lot of that body language and being realistic with how your audience perceives you, and knowing how to constantly adjust and tweak that. And that's the real skill as a performer for lay people, is knowing how to get the interaction. So pretty quickly if this routine's working. If it's not, it doesn't mean necessarily you should quit doing it, but you need to find a way to make it work. And so that's those constant little tweaks. And sometimes it's a small little pacing change, or so many little details that make a huge difference.
You bring up a great point because what you're talking about there is that hurts your ego. When you sense somebody burning your palm, you can pretend that they don't see it,
Yeah.
but to be honest with yourself means you have to go, I didn't do that right. There was a problem and it's my fault. That's hard for a lot of people to do, is break through that ego.
But if you don't do that, you're not going to improve. And that's why you see so many people thinking that they're doing a great job and they're killing, but because they've never killed. They've never really, had that time, and they're not aware of what people say when they walk away. And you have to talk to people about like what they really thought, what they saw, what they caught. And sometimes some things I don't mind they catch, because sometimes it's kind of a setup for something else that's going to happen in a second. And so sometimes a little bit of catching something leads them down the wrong path for what I'm about to do. And so there's reasons why I do some things, but a lot of that comes again from experience, and you just have to be honest with yourself and ask people.
I think that you're saying it right.
Because some people will tell you, but some people you just really have to read their body language and just have that sense. And I think a lot of magicians have that problem where they don't really have an accurate sense of how the audience perceives them.
I think you're 100% correct.
I've seen that a lot of times when someone says I really killed, and you saw the show, and they're like, yeah, that's okay. And other magicians are the opposite, where they do kill, and they're like, oh, that was terrible. I did a terrible job. And so it works both ways. You have to have that confidence, but not be too self-deprecating, but you always have to be constantly improving and tweaking things.
You know what? A lot of magicians, they perform 6 tricks for their friends, and their friends love them, and their mother loves them, or their Aunt Ethel loves them, or all that stuff, and they think I'm killing. And you have to sort of get out of that comfort zone a little bit, and that's where it's really hard. That's a hard thing to do.
When you perform for real people, I try to make, it's a delicate line, but I want to try to get. It's a numbers game. There are certain tricks, like you float a bill. You're going to fool whatever the number is, maybe 70% of the people, and they're going to be fried. There's 30% of people that are going to say, oh, it's a string, or I see a string, or I think there's a string, or whatever it is, and you've got nothing on, there's nothing there. There's no entertainment value, because it's completely ruined. So I always try to structure my magic and routines to get that 99.9%. And even if it's a magician in the crowd, even if maybe they know what I'm doing, now they're really impressed with the skill I'm doing.
Okay.
So that's part of the reason for me. I try to do stuff that no one else in my market's doing, no one else is doing, because I am either buying something really expensive, or I'm doing something that's really hard and takes a lot of practice. Even though I make it look easy, or they don't even know I'm doing it. That's part of the reason for me why I want to do that, because it really differentiates me from everybody else.
So it really is taking the entertainment value of the ultimate effect, but also thinking back to being honest about what your audience perceives helps you to determine where that sort of Venn diagram comes together of presentation to move to method.
Yeah, and I think that my style is more of a somewhat skill-based style, where the audience perceives that there's a lot of skill that's going on. But I think that you can't. I don't think that takes away from a lot of the magical effects I do. In fact, I know it doesn't. And I think it really increases it. And the reason is when people start thinking that you're doing things with skill, they give you credit. And it gives you respectability, and then now they know you're not their uncle or some lame magician they saw wherever. So that gives you a great amount of credibility, and that's this guy's really good with cards. Or whatever objects you're working with. And now if you do something where you can't explain it with sleight of hand, there's just no explanation with sleight of hand. What you've done is you've led them down the wrong path, and they made false assumptions that you're doing everything with skill, and that's the basis of all magic.
That's true.
And if you think about it as a magician, the time, like even just today, I got fooled by something Rick Merrill did, and it was using a gimmick card. And the reason is because, he's really good with cards, or whoever it is really good with cards. So you don't think he's going to use a Svengali deck, or a one-way forcing deck. And when a magician that's really good, that is awesome, and he uses something that's like a one-way forcing deck, it fries you. Mm-hmm. And this is a perfect example of how the perception of skill only increases the magical ability and the possibility of an effect. And at least that's how it's been for me, where I know as a magician when I've been fooled, it's because of that reason, not the opposite. Not the opposite what everybody else says, is that skill takes away from the magic. Which it can if you don't know your character, you don't know, if you're doing a 4H trick, that's a skill trick anyways, it's not a magic effect.
Correct.
So yeah, it doesn't take away from it. Yeah. It's just, it was never that to begin with,
I think you're absolutely right. But that's something I don't think a lot of people think about, really, is that element of how the skill can help increase the magic as long as your character and your, the way you portray it brings the audience to that conclusion. That's a hard thing to do.
It's a hard thing to do.
It's a really hard thing.
And that's a performance thing, is knowing your character, knowing how to get in and out of that, and knowing how to structure your routine so it works that way. Like a perfect example I give a lot is if you're doing sleight of hand moves and it's obviously maybe a multiple selection or something, and then you put the cards down and you do like a haunted pack, for example, where you're not touching the card. So it can't be explained with sleight of hand because you're not touching anything. And now this is, there's lots of different ways you can talk about this, but that creates an impossible moment for them, or something appears inside of a line, or whatever it is. That's completely impossible. You can't explain that with sleight of hand. And that's kind of what I try to go for a lot, is mixing those two things. That's just my style.
That's often where you hear the line from the spectators of, but he didn't touch the cards.
Yeah.
When you hear that, that's them sort of going, I know he's got skill, but this can't be explained with skill. It's, as you said, it's listening to your audience.
And it's just, it's playing off of that, leading them down, making them make the false assumption. That's what you want.
I think that's a great point. That's a really great point. I don't want to take up too much more of Karl's time, but here's the deal. If you like this type of thinking, and I really think that this comes from an element of somebody who is a true worker and somebody who understands an audience's perception of what magic is and what character is all about. And that's something I think a lot of, I don't call them beginners, but a lot of people, that's the leap I really think a lot of non-pro magicians need to make, myself included, is that leap from I'm doing tricks, I'm doing whatever, to I'm doing a show. This is a performance. Skill, entertainment, humor, character development, all of that is a full performance.
To be honest, I'm still working on it. It's not something I'm ever happy with exactly where I'm at, and so, but it's just a matter of experience. The more you do, the more work you do, the more work you get, and the better you get.
That's true.
But again, you have to be honest with yourself and constantly reevaluate.
Which is hard.
And have people around you that are willing to say the same thing, that help you and give you constructive criticism. It's a really important part.
It is an important part. So if you like this type of thinking and you want to learn a little more, you want to see some of Karl's stuff, how can some of the people out there get in touch with you and read some of your products, get some of your products, read some of your thinking?
A few of my things like Hein Shuffle and Hein 500 have been out in the market. My website, karlhein.com, is just kind of getting up and running, so that'll have a bunch of my new products that are going to be coming out and some of my old stuff too. So.
Is this thing you did yesterday going to be out anywhere?
It will be on a future DVD set.
Okay.
The Magic Square thing I do,
I don't want to start. Okay. All right. You chipped it, that's fine.
There's an old version of it in my lecture notes, actually.
Is there?
My lecture. It's not this. It's a more complicated version. This is a very simplified version I showed you today, which I think is, again, simplify it, make it much easier, much better, and now anybody can do it.
All I'm going to say is this. Karl took the Magic Square that a lot of people do and brought it to brought magic into it. Brought true magic, not just a test of mental skill, but brought an element of magic into it that I had never seen done before. And I was kicking myself like crazy that I never thought about it before, and it drove me crazy. I was like, Karl, I got to get him on Time to Be Awesome because I wanted to talk about the thinking that went behind this, and I thought that was great. So look for Karl's Magic Square stuff on some of his old lecture notes or when his future DVD project comes out. I'm going to recommend it right now, if nothing else, for this one trick, but the thinking behind it will be seen throughout all of his effects. So check that out. And karlhein.com, we'll link to that right now so you guys can see that. Karl,
sounds great.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. My name's David Corsaro. That's Karl Hein. Now go be awesome, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.